So I hope everyone out there in YouTube land is doing okay with this coronavirus stuff that's going on right now. Here in Australia, we're not in lockdown or anything yet, but there's more and more cases popping up, so it is possibly on the cards. But I figured while there are people stuck at home in lockdown with not much to do but watch YouTube videos, I would try and upload something. Hello, cut. And I realised in my last upload that it's been 5.5 years since I've uploaded anything about this car, and I did start this YouTube channel for this car, so that is a bit ridiculous, but it's now been 11 years since I put my Subaru conversion in. And I figured I'd just do a quick review of it, as I have changed a few things over the years and learnt a few lessons. So despite having a Subaru engine in my Volkswagen, I am still a die-hard air-cooled guy. I've been building them pretty much my entire life since I was a kid, and I do still have air-cooled power Volkswagens as well. But the reason I went Subaru powered in this one mainly was bang for buck. I would prefer to have a great big fuel-injected turbo Type 4 motor in this thing, but here in Australia that's just not a viable option. I could do about 4 Subaru conversions with the same power for the same money. But it came down to value, as I said. I had a 1776 in this car previously, and with the supercharger on it at 10 psi, it was putting out the same sort of power as a big Subaru, like a 2.5, but it wasn't a practical engine to be in a daily driven car. And how the Subaru conversion came about was I looked into putting fuel injection and also a coil pack wasted spark ignition system on my 1776, and both of those just on their own, doing it myself with Mega Squirt and Mega Jolt, were going to cost at least double what I could put a Subaru motor in for, which already had both those things to start with. So without boring people too much, I'll just stick to the basics. I originally bought a 1992 Subaru Liberty, or Legacy as they're known in the rest of the world, and that came with the EJ22 fuel injected motor, single overhead cam, and it was in really good condition. It had been owned by one lady since new and had 147,000 kilometres on it, which is about 70,000 miles, I think. But some drunk teenagers jumped on the roof of it and the insurance company totaled it, so it was the perfect owner car. But after only 2 weeks of driving that around, the usual Subaru story, the head gasket blew. And I thought no big deal. It had been probably never done before, so I started pulling the engine down. First thing I found was the thermostat had been gutted, which is always the first sign of head gasket issues in a Subaru. Then when I pulled the heads off, the engine was a complete write-off. It had been eaten away internally by electrolysis, and how that had happened was due to it being a low mileage engine. It had just never had coolant change done, and due to that, the coolant not doing its job after X many years let the engine block basically be eaten away. But the beauty of the Subaru conversion was I went straight down to the junkyard. $450 later, I had another EJ22 and I was back on my way. Anyway, that little engine served me well for 2 years, but then the hunger for more power kicked in and I looked into turboing it, but there's no easy way to turbo these cars and still keep the engine bay functional and not cut out the firewall, so I looked into going bigger instead, and the local Subaru mechanic that I'd befriended quite well by then offered me a EJ253 from a 2005 Subaru Legacy or Liberty that he'd done a WRX conversion on. Now, it's not completely standard. It's what's known as a Franken motor. So basically what that involved was taking the EJ25 bottom end and putting the heads off my EJ22 on it and all the manifold and engine management. Now the benefit of doing that was the engine was much smaller, so it didn't involve any extra bodywork to fit, and it didn't need any electrical or bolt-on stuff changed. It was all plug and play. So one of my main goals with this conversion was to not have to do any major body work to fit it in, which is the reason for sticking with a single overhead cam phase 1 motor. They're the same width as a Volkswagen engine, so all the original sheet metal in there is unmodified. The only area that needed modifying was the apron itself, which can be very easily changed for a stock one if you ever were to put a Volkswagen motor back in. So other than routine oil changes, this engine hasn't actually had any work done to it since it was fitted. I added up that it's done 118,000 kilometres since it went in. I was averaging 30,000 kilometres a year when I lived out on the farm, but when the farm was sold in 2015 and I bought my house in town, the mileage has dropped right back down, so it's now at 118, and it will be getting a timing belt service done and water pump very shortly because it's due at 125,000. But other than that, the only modifications that needed doing to the engine to fit it to the car were the throttle body had to be reversed, so I didn't have to chop out the firewall. So it's just a 180-degree bend, so it faces this way. Coolant manifold's actually left alone, but it has been shortened. So outlet runs into a aluminium header tank there with a radiator cut, and from that runs up to the front of the car. Underneath, obviously, shortened some. Many ways people do this. This one's a custom bought one. A company in Australia called Custom VW or Custom Off-Road were doing this at the time. So that is 85 millimetres or about 3.5 inches shorter than stock, but due to the wings out front, back, left and right, it actually retains stock capacity. So on a lowered car like this, it was essential. Muffler system, that was a EJ20 header I cut down shorter and modified to fit all around the sump. Runs into a 2.5 inch high flow cap. And for mufflers, I actually have two mufflers I run for this. This one I call my noisy one. It's only got a very small muffler on it. It is a 2.5 inch Mercury straight through. And it sounds awesome in person. Camera phones never do it justice. fits in behind a standard steel apron quite well. Can't see it very well down there, but it only uses one tailpipe. That one is a mock one. And this one here is my quiet muffler. I built this one a few years back for mainly doing long distance highway runs when the noisy one can get a bit drony and headachy. So the actual box on this one, it's actually the OEM rear box from an Australian Holden Commodore. They're the Walker branded ones, and it's significantly bigger than the Mercury one. It's also not a straight through, it's a chambered one. So offset on both sides. And due to its larger size, it doesn't fit behind a standard steel apron, so there's a fiberglass one moulded off the late model fuel injected Beetle rear apron, so it has the extra bulge and clearance for this. So it's just 2 bolts on the cat flange to remove, and cat approves. So it just made it a much nicer highway cruiser or early morning starts, but it still has that Subaru rumble, but is a much more mellow note without the bark. So the transmission in this car is the factory original 74 Super Beetle one, AT code with the single side plate. And originally I just left it exactly as it was. The engine bolts to it with an adapter plate and flywheel, and that did well for many years. I think about 4 or 5 years I ran it like that. I had the gearbox rebuilt when I first bought this car 20 years ago. I may or may not have been working on my reverse 180J turns as a irresponsible teenager and broke reverse, but it was only a very light freshen up, new bearings, new reverse, and that survived many years of supercharged and modified Volkswagens. And even with the Subaru, when it was pulled down, it showed normal wear and tear, nothing out of the ordinary. I had it pulled down because I initially just wanted a taller 4th gear put in, but as with most things, it snowballed. I ended up with a super diff, solid billet side plate, Weddell thrust plate, a whole bunch of other stuff. It's essentially the same as a Rancho Pro Street, but I figured I'd go the whole hog while it was apart. So regarding engine and gearbox mounts, there actually are no engine mounts. It's just bolted to the gearbox, same as a Volkswagen motor does. The gearbox, I just run standard rubber Volkswagen mounts. The urethane ones are absolutely horrible, and I wouldn't even consider solid mounting for a street car. I do, however, have a mid-mount on the nose cone of the gearbox, and you can't quite see it amongst all the coolant lines and aircon hoses, but there is a 5-bar Kafer brace to strengthen the forks, essential due to the added weight and torque of the motor. All the coolant lines are 1.5-inch stainless steel and run down the channel for the body bolts. It was important not to lose any ground clearance on a lowered car. And they lead up the front to the radiator, which is in a enclosure I've made. It is a full aluminium racing a Mach 1 Volkswagen GTI radiator. So the coolant lines come up on either side, and there is also obviously a air conditioning condenser in front of it. I was running thermo fans on it, but they are so noisy, so I've switched to a pair of Alfa Romeo shrouded fans, which are much quieter and actually work better with the shrouding. So the spare wheel well, I cut out in one big piece like that, so it can always be welded back in if ever I went back to a Volkswagen motor for whatever reason. So for air to the radiator, being an Australian built Super Beetle, this one didn't have the vented front apron originally. So to start off with, I did actually just cut slots in it so it looked like a factory air conditioned one. But I found that that wasn't letting enough air in, so I cut all the slots out and put the mesh in there, which after 11 years is now looking a little bit sad. But when this car eventually gets repainted, I will be fitting a factory air conditioned one. And you can see it also goes through a second lot of mesh in my Cami spoiler. So my fuel system is a bit of a clusterfuck that was only meant to be temporary, but 11 years later, here we are, still the same. I do plan on eventually putting a in-tank pump setup in, but this has worked very well for 11 years, hence why it's still as it is. But the original outlet of the VW fuel tank comes into just a low volume lift pump there, which feeds into a 2-litre surge tank, which has an overflow back into the main fuel tank. One line runs down to a external EFI fuel pump. Now that is a Bosch 044, and it's actually surprisingly quiet. Everyone moans and complains external ones are noisy, but that one you can't even hear it. The return from the fuel rail also goes back into the surge tank, and the return out of that goes back in to the filler neck up there. So all my engine management I've mounted under the rear seat. The ECU, various fuse boxes and relays and coil igniter all mounted to a plate there, and the loom comes in via the old heater duct there, so no bodywork modifications to fit. So if there's any aspects about this conversion that I haven't covered, that someone wants to know about, drop a comment down below and I'll do my best to explain it down there.